This is the lecture on constructing and presenting persuasive messages. The way in which we communicate with others has significant consequences for us. And as much as we wish it weren't so, it turns out that new communication technology by itself does not guarantee that our communication will be clear and understandable to others. Basically, we can break our persuasive communication down into two parts: the discursive or the verbal language-based part, and the non-discursive. Non-discursive information is the audio and visual information that goes along with the verbal messages that we use. Audio and visual information is important because it gives us clues and information that can call up emotions and attitudes without taking the time to explain things in great detail. It turns out that carefully selected visual imagery is a key element that aids people's ability to comprehend messages. And here's an example on this slide of a Budweiser box, right? So everybody sees the Clydesdale horses and it makes you think of beer. And branding is something that Budweiser is particularly good at. What is branding? It's a process in which marketers link their products with symbols that evoke emotions or attitudes. Often these symbols directly represent products or ideas, but just as often you'll find that images serve as kind of icons that give us clues about key cultural features. Some kinds of images really call up a strong emotional component. So often when you see things having the Statue of Liberty, what's the first word that comes to your mind? It's probably freedom. The Nike swoosh is another example of an icon that doesn't really have any direct representation of a particular product or idea, but we all know that it stands for the Nike shoe brand. Now, your textbook talked about Gestalt theory, which is a particular school of thought in psychology that really focuses on this idea that the whole altogether is greater than if you added up its individual component parts. An easier way to think of it is just to recognize that the things that we see are affected by their location and proximity to other things. And how we apply this in persuasion is making sure that our messages are unified and that perceptually they seem to go together. One aspect of Gestalt theory is this idea of figure-ground relationships. So here we're looking at a palm tree, a single palm tree that's set against this kind of blue and white wash of the sand and sea and sky. The background is often referred to simply as the ground. And when we're using visual images, we should make sure that the ground doesn't dominate the item that we want the person to look at, unless, of course, our message intends to suggest that our item is somehow vulnerable. Another principle is the principle of similarity. In our minds, we tend to want to group similar things together. And so when we put persuasive images into a particular context, the images should have some sense of connection with each other. Likewise, we tend to assume that there are connections and relationships between items if they are located very close to one another. So check out this picture of the boys and the dog. When you first look at it, you might even think that the dog is boy number 4. They do just seem to go together. Likewise, the layout of a message visually creates a kind of a line that our eye will follow. So when we're looking at this picture of a wave crashing into the ocean, our eye is going to probably start up in that upper left-hand corner where we would typically look if we were, for example, going to start reading on a page. And then our eye will follow the crest of that wave over and around. So when we're thinking about where we place things in an ad, for example, we want to make sure that we place them in a place that the viewer's eye is going to naturally want to go, or to look in a direction that the eye is naturally going to follow. So can you see what is in this photo? We fill in what is left out but implied. So this picture of the Dalmatian dog has no line to indicate where the dog begins and where the splotchy background ends, but our eyes are really good at filling in detail that may otherwise be missing. When we use images on a page, we have two different ways that we can go in deciding how we're going to place our images. This first slide here shows formal balance. So we've got a set of rocks, they're all stacked on top of one another, and while they're not perfectly equal on both sides of that line that I've drawn, in general we have a good sense of stability. We also place that line of rocks directly in the center of the page. This is what we call formal balance, and formal balance gives the viewer a sense of stability, reliability, but it may also be a little bit boring. Here's another picture of rocks, but this time we have the rocks balanced in such a way that most of the weight is to the right of the red line and just a little bit is off to the left. We also move the header over to the left side of the slide. This is what we call informal balance. It tends to feel much more creative and artistic, fresh, and energetic than the more stodgy formal line we looked at before. We can also exploit images that we might use to help our viewer's eye go in certain directions. So here I have a picture of a little guy. He's holding a pair of binoculars and he's intently looking off to the left side of the page. If I have a photo like this, I'm going to put the important points off to the left of the image, because as soon as I see that boy looking, I'm going to do what we always do when we see somebody looking in a particular direction. I'm going to look that way too. If I don't have a particular set of words that I want to use, though, I'm probably going to decide to place the boy on the page facing to the right. And this is because if I'm reading a book and I get to the extreme bottom right hand of the page, what is it going to cause me to do? It's going to cause me to turn that page. And in much the same way, I should place my images so that they're looking in the direction that the viewer's eye would normally go, which in this case would be to the right. We should also think about color when we're thinking about the persuasive power of our nonverbal messages. Warm colors, reds, oranges, and yellows, are active, friendly, and energizing, although you do need to be careful because red can also be a signifier of danger. On the other hand, if you want to give a sense of a natural, relaxing environment, you're probably going to choose cool colors like blues and greens in the photo above. Well, now this is interesting. Text and type are another visual element that can really change the feel of a message. And when I uploaded this slide, you can see that the bottom pink doesn't look like anything at all. That was supposed to be a decorative font in a bright splashy color, so you'll have to use your imagination here. You can see though that we have some other types of type that do show up on this slide. The first is a Roman type, and Times New Roman is the default in Microsoft Word. The thing that makes it a serif type of font is that it has those tiny little lines at the ends of all of the protruding parts of the letters. And those little lines help a person's eye follow the text, particularly when they're reading print materials. Recent research, though, has shown that you're better off using a font that does not have serifs, like the serif font just below there, because it turns out that when people are reading things on a screen, it's actually easier to read without the clutter of the serifs getting in the way. And then there are times that we want to create a different environment altogether, so we could use a cursive or even a decorative font, and we have the whole spectrum of colors to choose from. Now, when we're thinking about how to visually represent our message, it's important to use the right cultural palette. So here I have two different images that could be used to refer to Social Security. The image on the left shows someone's Social Security wages, and if you've ever received tax documents from an employer, then chances are pretty good that you also know that your wages are taxed for Social Security, so you never do quite get the full amount of what you earn. And so if I'm speaking to a younger audience and I want to talk about Social Security, I'm probably going to use that picture to the left. On the other hand, though, that picture wouldn't have nearly as much meaning if I were devising a persuasive message for somebody my my parents' age, because they're in the position where they receive Social Security checks in the mail or perhaps by direct deposit these days. So that's the non-discursive part of our communication messages, but we also need to put some thought into how we're going to create verbal messages that will really work with the visual messages. And before I even start to devise a message, I need to begin by understanding my audience. Who is it exactly that I'm talking to? What are their values, attitudes, and interests? Do they have prior knowledge about the topic? What's the likelihood that they're going to accept or reject my message? And what are some existing values that might be able to use as a good reason to support my persuasive efforts with this audience? So here I have a picture of a couple of guys that are pigging out on some delicious looking ice cream. So we're going to assume that we're talking to an audience of young kids. But in our hypothetical example, our goal is to get those young kids to eat some vegetables. And it's important to know what it is that you want to accomplish when you're putting together a persuasive message. Your goal should be realistic, because even the most clever presentation is unlikely on its own to influence more than about 3 to 4% of your audience. So the goal should be to move people perhaps in a positive direction toward vegetables. Now, once I've decided what my goal is, I can begin to create my script, my outline, that organizes my ideas and presents the points that I want to present in a way that's going to be appealing and persuasive to an audience. I should be very clear with my thesis, because that thesis is the most important sentence of the entire message. It identifies the primary conclusion that I want the audience to accept. So maybe my thesis is that vegetables can be fun too. Now, once I've presented that thesis, it's going to be up to me to support my ideas with good reasons that justify that thesis to the audience I'm talking to. I may need to use specific examples to dramatize things that I want the audience to believe. I should probably provide some factual evidence or perhaps expert testimony to help prove my points. And I can use comparisons, analogies, and metaphors to add detail and link my ideas to the audience experience. And certainly Popeye is a fun cartoon, and look, he loves vegetables. Now, once I've got the main points that I want to cover into my outline, I should go back and think about how I'm going to introduce my key idea. And I have 3 goals with my introduction. First, I want to garner attention to the topic. Second, I want to establish goodwill with the audience. I want them to know that I really have their best interests in heart. I want to also address my own credibility, highlighting the similarities between myself and the members of my audience. And sometimes we can do this through the use of humor. Certainly Mr. Potato Head's a vegetable, and he's a lot of fun. Now, when it's time to wrap up my case, I should think of a strong conclusion that reviews the important ideas and wraps everything back around to that idea of fun. So while we might not think that a package would contain carrots and that could be a good time, you never know. Perhaps there's a way to wrap that into a conclusion on a speech about eating your vegetables. Now, this may seem a little bit like an afterthought, but I didn't want to end without talking about whether or not you should address opposing views when you're preparing a persuasive message. Whether to spend time on opposing views really depends on where the audience is at the beginning and how much they actually know about the topic. We should also, of course, be thinking about the ethical implications of one-sided versus two-sided presentations, and we'll talk more about ethics next week. If an audience already agrees with your position, you really don't have to go to great lengths to provide both sides of the story. However, if you're facing a hostile audience that's unlikely to agree with you, it can be very helpful to provide a more balanced presentation, because hostile audiences tend to respond more positively to that balance. They feel like you're considering their perspective as well. The general rule is that the more an audience knows about a topic, the more the persuader should acknowledge and address counter-arguments. And there's little risk in this strategy because even if a person wasn't aware of an argument against your position, presenting that argument could provide some inoculation.